The voice cut through the darkness, sharp and cold. "Ma'am, step out now, or I will light you up." Officer Harlan Cole threw the words into the thin silence inside Lena Harper's car. His voice carried no hesitation, no attempt to understand, only the blunt force of a man who believed the badge on his chest allowed him to speak to a mother, as if she were a threat. Lena felt her pulse rise. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. In the back seat, her young son, Kai, lifted his head from sleep with a quiet whimper. Cole repeated himself, louder this time, and his flashlight burned through the driver's window, as if searching for something that did not exist. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but she barely formed the words, "I'm complying," before the door swung open and the night shifted from tense to violent. She felt his hand clamp around her arm, felt the sudden pull, and before she could brace herself, her forehead struck the metal door frame. A spark of pain shot across her vision. Blood touched her lip. Kai screamed her name, a small voice trying to fight a grown man's fury. Cole growled something about resisting, though Lena had not lifted a hand. Above everything, the flashing lights washed the street in blue and red, leaving no room for mercy. The moment those lights appeared behind Lena's car late at night, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that every black driver in South Dallas learns to recognize. She had just finished a long trauma shift at the hospital and was only minutes from home. Her uniform still carried the faint smell of antiseptic. Her badge swung gently from her collar as she checked her mirror and signaled to change lanes. She did everything right. She always did. Yet Cole claimed she had failed to signal, a pretext she knew too well from the stories told by her patients, her neighbors, and her own family. She rolled the window down halfway, kept both hands where he could see them, and spoke in a calm voice she had practiced for years. "Officer, may I ask what's happening?" Cole leaned in with a glare that dismissed the question before it was finished. In the back seat, Kai fought to steady his breathing. He clutched the stuffed dinosaur his mother had given him at the start of her shift. The boy sensed danger in a way children often do, without needing details. Cole's flashlight swung toward him, forcing the child to turn his face away, and the officer muttered something about keeping that kid quiet. Lena swallowed the anger rising in her throat and whispered, "It's okay, baby. Stay still." Her voice trembled, but she tried to anchor him, even as her own fear grew heavy. Cole ordered her out again, harsher this time. She unbuckled slowly, every motion deliberate, praying he would not claim she moved too quickly. But the instant she stepped 1 foot outside, he jerked her forward and pinned her against the car. Lena gasped as her cheek scraped the metal. She tasted the copper of her own blood and blinked back the haze. "I'm not resisting," she whispered, though her voice was swallowed by the street. Cole did not care. He forced her arms behind her back, twisting just enough to send pain up her shoulder. The body camera footage would later show nothing for the first brief moments. A malfunction. The department would call it a coincidence, but a bystander walking home from a late shift heard the commotion and raised his phone. His shaky recording captured the violent moments, the ones Dallas would debate for years. In that brief clip, Lena's face is pressed against the car, her breath uneven, her wrists clamped in cuffs. Cole towers over her, shouting commands she cannot follow because he gives them faster than she can respond. And in the background, Kai cries until his voice cracks. Lena tried to steady herself, desperate to hold on to a small piece of dignity. She asked through clenched teeth if she could reassure her son. Cole snapped back. "You talk when I tell you to talk." His words echoed like a verdict already delivered. He dragged her toward the patrol car, her feet stumbling, her head throbbing where metal had met bone. She thought of her patients, of all the times she had soothed someone else's fear, of the children who had clung to her after surviving something they never should have faced. And now she stood on the other side of that experience, powerless, bruised, and terrified for the boy watching everything. Kai's scream pierced the air again, louder this time, and the bystanders' recording caught the moment Lena turned her head just enough to see her son's small hands pressed against the back window. She whispered, "Mommy's okay," though she knew he could not hear her. Cole shoved her into the back of his cruiser, and the door slammed shut with a finality that felt like a sentence. Lena leaned forward, breathing slowly, tasting blood, praying she would live through the night, and that her son would not carry this moment like a scar he could never name. The cruiser pulled away from the street, leaving her car behind, its headlights still on, its engine humming as if waiting for its owner to return. Lena felt every bump in the road and every shift in the car. She wondered if anyone would tell her husband. She wondered if anyone would believe her. And above all, she wondered if Kai would ever sleep through the night again. As the patrol car turned toward the jail, she closed her eyes and repeated the one truth she had left. I did nothing wrong. That night, 3 lives changed forever. The officer who believed force was power, the mother who fought only to survive the next breath, and the child who learned far too early that danger could wear a uniform. Lena Harper did not remember the exact moment the steel door closed behind her, but she remembered the sound. It was the kind of sound that settled into the bones, slow and heavy, as if the world were sealing itself shut. She had been booked, fingerprinted, photographed, and stripped of every piece of her identity except her name. They charged her with resisting arrest, a phrase that felt like an insult each time she repeated it in her mind. She tried to steady her breath. She tried to remember the faces of the patients she had helped only hours earlier. She tried to imagine her son's voice, but thinking of Kai was the one thing that made her knees weaken. They promised her she would get a phone call. They said it almost casually, as if it were a small courtesy. But hours passed, then more hours. The clock on the wall meant little. Her world shrank into a cement cell with a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and a fluorescent light that hummed through the night. She wiped the dried blood from her lip and whispered, "I'm okay," even though she did not know if that was true. Outside the jail, her husband, Elias Grant, landed at the airport after a late-night flight from Washington. He was still in his suit, still carrying the weight of unfinished meetings and the authority of his position. But none of it mattered when he saw his mother waiting with Kai. The boy would not lift his head. He held the same stuffed dinosaur he had carried in the car, but now its seams were damp from the tears he refused to shed in public. Elias knelt down to him, speaking softly, trying to reach him. "Where's Mommy?" Kai whispered, barely audible. Elias looked into his son's trembling eyes and felt something break inside him. He wanted to tell the truth. He wanted to say she was safe, but he could only say, "I'm going to bring her home." His voice quivered despite every effort to steady it. His mother squeezed his arm, a quiet reminder of the strength he had leaned on since childhood. The next morning, Elias drove straight to the jail. He had spent the night pacing, replaying the fragments of the bystanders' video, studying every frame until exhaustion forced him to sit down. He asked for Lena. They told him she was not yet available. He showed his credentials from the U.S. Marshal's service. They nodded politely and repeated the same phrase. He asked for a supervisor. They told him one would review the situation. He felt the familiar frustration that came from being inside a system that could crush someone like his wife without even looking back. He knew the rules, knew the policies, knew the avenues of appeal, and yet none of that stopped the steel wall he now faced. Lena sat in the holding area, her wrists still sore from the cuffs. She asked the guard for a phone call again. He told her to wait. She asked if her son was safe. He shrugged. She asked if someone could check on her car. He walked away. She pressed her palms together and tried to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Every minute stretched like an hour. She remembered training nights at the hospital when she comforted victims of violence, reminded them to breathe, reminded them they were safe. She tried to use those same words on herself, but they felt thin. By the second day, she had still not spoken to her husband. She had still not touched her son. She had still not been allowed access to an attorney. A nurse came to check the bruise on her forehead, gently lifted her chin, and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the first human kindness she had received since the arrest. The nurse wrote down her injuries, took photographs, and promised to file the report properly. Lena nodded, grateful for the small gesture, yet afraid it would vanish into a file no one would ever open. Meanwhile, Elias began digging. He requested Officer Harlan Cole's personnel history. He expected resistance, but the folder arrived faster than expected, a sign that someone inside the department had seen the video and recognized the coming storm. Elias opened the file at his kitchen table. Multiple internal complaints, several for excessive force, others for conduct unbecoming, several marked pending for years, most of them closed as unfounded. He read the summaries slowly, and with each line, his stomach tightened. Different names, different locations, but the same pattern, the same phrases repeated, the same descriptions of unnecessary aggression. It was as if the city had been handed warning after warning and chosen to bury each one. He felt anger rising, but it was not the kind of anger that urged retaliation. It was the steady, focused anger of a man trained to work within the law, to gather evidence, to set a system in motion. He knew violence would not protect his family, but the truth might. He sent messages to contacts in the DOJ Civil Rights Division. He forwarded the video, the reports, the complaint summaries. He did not identify himself as a husband. He identified himself as a senior federal official concerned about patterns of misconduct. He knew that once he set the wheels turning, they would not stop. Late on the second night, he returned to the jail again. He asked for her. He was told she had been moved for processing. He asked when she would be released. They said the judge would not review her case until morning. He asked again for a supervisor. One finally appeared, a tired man with a folder in his hands. Elias kept his voice calm, measured, formal. "My wife has been held without contact with her family for an extended period. She is a nurse with no criminal history, and the video clearly contradicts the charge against her. I need someone to explain what is happening." The supervisor stared at him for a long moment before sighing. There were complications, he said. Elias felt the urge to demand answers, but he kept his tone steady. You have until sunrise to resolve those complications. The supervisor nodded and walked away. Lena spent that night staring at the ceiling. Every sound in the jail felt amplified. Every clang of metal made her flinch. She wondered if Kai was sleeping, or if he was curled up awake, afraid she might never come home. She wondered if Elias had seen the video. She wondered if her patients would notice her absence. She wondered why her life had been reduced to a charge that even the arresting officer did not believe. When she was finally released days later, her eyes adjusted slowly to the daylight. Elias stood waiting, Kai in his arms. The boy reached for her immediately, burying his face in her shoulder. She held him tightly, ignoring the pain in her bruised arm, and whispered, "Mommy's here." Elias wanted to speak, wanted to reassure her, but he saw the exhaustion and the humiliation in her expression. He knew that words were not enough. As they walked to the car, he whispered gently, "We're not letting this go." Lena closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and nodded. She understood what those words meant. She knew the fight ahead would be long and painful and public, but she also knew something else, something that steadied her this time. The truth would not be pushed aside. It would be carried into rooms where excuses could no longer survive, and at the center of it all, her family would stand together, scarred but unbroken. The video surfaced on a quiet afternoon, posted by a man who had walked home from his shift, still shaken by what he had witnessed. He uploaded it without a caption, only the raw footage itself, those violent moments of struggle, shouting, and a child's scream that cut straight through the calm of anyone who pressed play. Within minutes, Sophia Reyes, a young organizer known for tracking Dallas police encounters, reposted it with a simple sentence, "This is Lena Harper." She added 2 tags, #DallasStopsLena and #SayHerName, then placed her phone down and waited. She did not have to wait long. The clip traveled from one platform to another, then to local news pages, then to national feeds. It gathered millions of views in days, climbing with a speed that felt like a storm ripping through the city before anyone could prepare. People watched Lena being pinned against her car, heard her whisper that she was not resisting, and saw Cole dragging her to the cruiser with a force that looked less like law enforcement and more like punishment. And behind it all was the sound of Kai, his small voice cracking as he cried for his mother. It was that sound more than anything that shifted the story from anger to outrage. Strangers who had never heard Lena's name before began calling the police department, asking how a nurse heading home from a shift could become a suspect in a matter of seconds. In the Grant home, the video played in silence. Elias stood in the doorway while Lena sat on the couch with Kai pressed tightly against her side. She had seen the arrest from inside the moment itself, but watching it from the outside felt like another wound. She reached up to touch the healing bruise on her forehead, as if reminding herself that what she saw on the screen was real. Elias watched her reaction closely, seeing the pain in her eyes when the officer's hand jerked her forward and the panic when her son's crying grew louder. He heard her breath shorten at the exact second her head hit the frame. "Stop it," she whispered, turning away from the screen. Elias gently turned it off. Kai buried his face in her arm, trembling. He had not spoken much since the night of the arrest, communicating mostly through nods and short, tight gestures. Elias stroked the boy's hair with a quiet tenderness, aware that no amount of reassurance could erase what his son had witnessed. That evening, Sophia called Elias directly. She introduced herself softly, explaining that she had been one of the first to circulate the footage. "People need to know the truth," she said. "We're getting messages from others who say they were stopped by the same officer. I don't want to overwhelm you, but you should see this." She sent him screenshots. An Uber driver describing being pulled from his car on a traffic stop that went nowhere. A young mother who said Cole searched her vehicle for no reason while her toddler cried in the back seat. A high school honor student who claimed he was told to stop running his mouth after asking why he was stopped. Their stories were not identical, but they shared a common thread, a sense of humiliation, a lingering fear, and a belief that complaining would do nothing. Elias read each one slowly, letting the weight of their words settle. He could feel something shifting, a widening awareness that this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. It was a warning system that the city had ignored. Once the video reached widespread attention, the comment sections transformed into a public forum of anger, grief, and questions the city could no longer avoid. People demanded the release of the full body cam footage. They asked why Lena had been held so long without contact. They asked why the officer still had his job. They asked how many complaints Dallas had dismissed over the years. Dallas had. Protest schedules appeared online. City council members released statements calling the footage deeply troubling, a phrase that did little to calm the rising tide. Reporters showed up at the family's home, forming a line on the sidewalk. Elias stepped outside briefly, his voice steady but firm. "My wife is recovering. My son is traumatized. We will speak in time. For now, respect our home." They stepped back respectfully, But the cameras remained, pointed toward the house like silent witnesses. Inside, Lena tried to steady herself. The attention felt overwhelming. She had never wanted to be the center of a public storm. She wanted to work, care for her patients, pick up her son from school, and come home without fear. But now she understood that silence would not protect her. She sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, breathing slowly. "I don't want this to happen to someone else," she said quietly. Elias nodded. He had already taken the first steps. He forwarded the video to contacts in the DOJ Civil Rights Division, along with Cole's complaint records. He labeled his message as a matter requiring urgent review. He knew the process well. He knew that once a case like this reached the right hands, it could trigger a federal civil rights evaluation. And he knew that Dallas would not be able to explain away the footage with a simple statement. While the video spread across the country, Kai began therapy arranged through a program for children who witnessed police violence. His therapist, a calm, patient woman, met with him regularly. At first, he would not speak. He communicated with drawings, each page filled with thick black lines, jagged shapes, and flashes of red and blue. Lena sat beside him during the sessions, holding his hand, letting him lean against her shoulder when the memories grew too heavy. She often left those appointments with tears she tried to hide from him. She would step into the hallway, cover her mouth, and breathe slowly until her chest loosened. Elias watched her quietly, steadying her with a gentle touch whenever she faltered. By the following days, the story dominated local news. Commentators debated policing in South Dallas, pointing to data showing that black drivers in the area were stopped far more often than others. Analysts replayed the arrest repeatedly, each time exposing the cracks in the official report. Former officers spoke on air, saying it was clear the force used on Lena was excessive. The pressure grew until the Dallas Police Department held a brief press conference. The spokesperson described the incident as under review and asked the public to avoid jumping to conclusions. But those words fell flat against a wave of evidence already in circulation. Soon after, a senior DOJ official called Elias directly. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and unmistakably serious. "We've seen the footage. We've reviewed the officer's record. This warrants a pattern or practice assessment." Elias closed his eyes, letting the news settle. Lena looked at him from across the room, searching his expression. He nodded gently. "They're opening an investigation," he said. Her breath caught for a moment, as if she were unsure whether to feel relief or fear. She reached for his hand. He moved to her side and held it tightly. The city did not know it yet, But those violent moments of video had just set a federal machine in motion, one that would expose years of overlooked warnings, one that would force Dallas to confront what had long been ignored, and one that would pull the Harper family into a journey longer and harder than they could have imagined. The firestorm had begun, and there was no turning back. The federal investigation began not with fanfare, but with a quiet coordination call between the DOJ Civil Rights Division and the FBI Dallas Field Office, a call that set the tone for what would become the most comprehensive review of Dallas police traffic stop practices in years. Special Agent Elena Vargas, a measured and relentless investigator known for her clarity and calm under pressure, was assigned to lead the field inquiry. She started by gathering every prior complaint, every stop logged by Officer Harlan Cole, and every data point she could extract from Dallas PD's internal system. The numbers told a story before the witnesses ever spoke. In South Dallas, during the same late hours, Lena drove home from the hospital. Black drivers were stopped significantly more often than white drivers. Vargas reviewed each traffic stop linked to Cole, focusing on patterns of escalation, missing footage, and ambiguous justifications. She read the language in the reports, noting the repetition of phrases like non-compliant driver and furtive movements, the vague terms that had been used to close complaints for years. She understood that the real story would come from the people behind those reports, and so, over the following weeks, she began calling them in. The first interview took place in a small federal conference room where a nervous Uber driver recounted how Cole had dragged him from his car years earlier. He had not filed an official complaint because he believed nothing would change. He said the officer accused him of driving suspiciously, though he had been following the GPS exactly. Vargas listened without interrupting, taking notes only after each pause. She asked clear questions, never pushing, but never letting details slip by. When the driver finished, he exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. She thanked him with a steady tone that conveyed respect, not pity. The next interview was with a single mother who still trembled when she described the night her children cried from the back seat as Cole searched her car without consent. She had been on her way home from a double shift, exhausted and overwhelmed. She remembered asking if she could call her sister to pick up the kids, and she remembered Cole telling her, "You don't make the rules here." The search turned up nothing. She received a warning for swerving, a claim she denied. Vargas watched the woman's hands shake, offering tissues but not interrupting. Every detail mattered, not only for the report, but for building a pattern the city could no longer deny. By the 10th interview, the pattern grew sharper, more undeniable. Former students, Delivery drivers and elderly residents of South Dallas told variations of the same story. Brief stops turning aggressive without reason, searches conducted without cause, body cam footage missing or incomplete, and complaints dismissed through internal channels that seemed designed to bury them. Vargas built a color-coded chart on her office wall, each name a small marker in a widening map of misconduct. But she knew that before any conclusions could be drawn, she needed to hear from the man at the center of the storm. When Cole was ordered to appear for questioning, he walked into the room with his jaw set and eyes hollow. He had been suspended with pay, a detail that infuriated many in the community, but standard procedure prevented immediate termination. He sat opposite Vargas, arms crossed, defensive, before a question was asked. She began with the arrest report. His answers were clipped, mechanical, as though rehearsed. He insisted that Lena had refused commands, that her body language indicated a threat, and that he had followed protocol. Vargas played the brief clip of the violent moments. His posture stiffened. When she asked why the body camera footage malfunctioned, he repeated the same phrase the department had used for years. Technical issues outside my control. Vargas did not argue. She simply asked him to explain why he had not de-escalated when Lena repeatedly stated she was complying. Cole's answers grew shorter, more defensive. By the end of the interview, he was sweating through his shirt, and the room felt heavier than when he had entered. While Vargas built her case, Elias continued his own work from within the federal system. He met with internal investigators at the Marshal's service, laying out the timeline of the arrest, the delay in contact, and the injuries his wife had endured. The internal investigators shifted uncomfortably. They recognized his name, his position, and the weight his statements carried. When he finished, the room was silent. One investigator cleared his throat and asked if he believed there was a pattern of misconduct. Elias answered without hesitation. "It's not a belief," he said. "It's a fact supported by the data you've been ignoring." His words echoed across the table, and for the first time, the department saw that this case would not be buried like the others. Lena also met with federal investigators. She sat with quiet strength, her hands folded, recounting the events of that night. The scar on her forehead had begun to fade, but the memory had not. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing the fear she felt when Cole dragged her from the car. The sudden pain when her head hit the frame, the helplessness when she heard her son scream. Vargas listened with a gravity that matched the moment. It was not simply the details of the event that mattered. It was the portrait of a woman who had done everything right and still ended up bruised and jailed. As the weeks passed, the data analysis expanded. Vargas and her team built a comprehensive spreadsheet that tracked the race of drivers, the reasons for stops, the frequency of escalation, and the outcomes of each encounter. The disparities were stark in South Dallas. Black drivers accounted for the majority of stops during night shifts, despite representing a smaller proportion of traffic volume. Many stops had vague justifications. Many lacked full footage. Many ended without citations. The numbers painted a picture of a policing culture shaped by bias, reinforced by weak oversight, and protected by qualified immunity. When the preliminary findings were presented to the DOJ, the language was clear and unequivocal. Dallas PD demonstrated significant racial disparities in traffic stop practices, with particular concentration in South Dallas and Oak Cliff. The report highlighted unjustified escalations, a failure to discipline repeat offenders, and systemic issues in data oversight and body camera compliance. It was the kind of language that signaled more than concern. It signaled the beginning of federal intervention. Word of the investigation spread through the city. Some officers expressed quiet fear, knowing that oversight meant accountability in ways they had never seen. Community members held meetings, sharing stories that had gone unheard for years. Others expressed skepticism, unsure whether the federal presence would lead to real change. But the momentum was undeniable. The storm that began with a bystander's shaky video had grown into a force that neither the department nor the city could ignore. And at the center of it all stood a nurse who carried a scar on her forehead, a husband who understood how systems worked from the id, and a community that had waited far too long for this moment. By the end of several months, the DOJ formally announced the pattern or practice investigation. Dallas officials stood at a podium, their faces drawn, their statements carefully worded. They promised cooperation, they promised transparency, they promised reform. But behind those promises lay a truth that Lena and Elias understood better than any. Real accountability would not come from promises. It would come from facts, testimony, data, and the unrelenting work of people willing to speak. The opening act was over. The federal trial was coming, and the city was about to learn what happens when truth refuses to be silenced. The federal trial opened on a clear morning in the federal courthouse, though no one inside paid attention to the weather. What mattered was the weight in the air, the quiet anticipation, and the understanding that the next days would shape not only one officer's fate, but the city's conscience. Harlan Cole entered the courtroom first, wearing a dark suit instead of his uniform. His shoulders noticeably smaller than they once appeared on the street. He avoided eye contact with the gallery, avoided the reporters, and avoided the image of himself projected across media screens for months. His attorney sat stiffly beside him, arranging papers with the rigid precision of a man who knew the evidence was already stacked against him. Across the aisle, Lena Harper took her seat with deliberate calm. She wore a simple blouse, her hair pulled back, her posture upright, her scar faint but visible above her eyebrow. Elias sat beside her, hands folded, breathing steadily, and behind them sat a gallery filled with nurses, neighbors, former patients, activists, and strangers who had seen the video and refused to forget. The room felt like a collective heartbeat, slow and steady, waiting for the first word to be spoken. The prosecution opened with a clarity that left no room for confusion. The federal attorney stood before the jury, citizens of varied backgrounds, and explained the charge. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a violation of federal code. His voice was firm, controlled, and unhurried. He described the night on the street, the officer's commands, the unjustified escalation, and the brief clip of violent moments that had brought the entire country to a halt. He spoke of the malfunctioning body camera, the prior complaints, the racial disparities in traffic stops, and the power imbalance between a frightened driver and an officer who acted with unchecked authority. He finished with a simple sentence that settled into the room like a final truth. This case is about power misused, trust violated, and a mother who did everything right yet was treated as if she had no rights at all. Cole's attorney countered with arguments the jury had expected, claims of officer safety, the unpredictability of traffic stops, the impossibility of making perfect judgments under pressure. He insisted that Lena had not complied quickly enough, that Cole feared she might have a weapon, that the officer's actions were justified by his belief, not by the facts. But the tone lacked conviction. Even he knew that belief alone would not erase what the video showed. He tried to cast doubt on the bystander's angle, on the audio quality, on Lena's movements. But every argument seemed to crumble under its own weight. The jury listened politely, but their expressions remained still, offering no hint of sympathy. When Lena testified, the courtroom grew so quiet that even the soft hum of the air system felt loud. She walked to the stand with a calm dignity, her hands steady as she took the oath. The prosecutor guided her through the events of that night. Her voice was gentle, precise, unwavering. She described the moment the lights appeared behind her, the tone of Cole's commands, the force of his hand when he dragged her from the car. She recounted the shock of her head striking the doorframe, the taste of blood, and the overwhelming fear that she might not survive the night. When she reached the part where Kai screamed for her, she paused. Her breath trembled, but she did not break. She pressed her fingertips together and continued, her voice quieter but still clear. "All I wanted was to reach him," she said, but he looked at me like I was something dangerous. The defense attempted to rattle her, asking why she had not complied sooner, why her hands were not raised higher, why her body had moved when he pulled her. Lena responded with the same calm tone, explaining each moment with clarity. "I did what he told me," she said. "He moved faster than I could react." Her answer silenced the attorney, who realized he had nothing left to challenge. When she stepped down, the gallery rose in quiet respect, not with applause, but with the collective acknowledgement of a woman who had endured humiliation and chosen truth over anger. Next came the voice the courtroom had been preparing for. Kai, testifying by pre-recorded video to shield him from the trauma of facing the officer in person. The recording played on a large screen, showing a small boy sitting in a gently lit room, legs swinging nervously, hands folding and unfolding. His voice was quiet, but honest. He described waking up to the bright lights, hearing the officer shout, and watching his mother's head hit the car. He described crying for her, calling out for her, and not understanding why she could not come to him. He lowered his head as he spoke, and at one moment he whispered, "I thought they were taking her away forever." Some jurors swallowed hard, others blinked back moisture. Even the judge paused before continuing, giving the room a moment to breathe. The prosecution then called Special Agent Elena Vargas, who presented the data that had formed the backbone of the federal investigation. She spoke with formal precision, describing the significantly higher stop rate for black drivers, the pattern of missing footage, the repeated internal complaints against Cole, and the consistent language of escalation in his reports. Each chart she displayed strengthened the case, placing the arrest in a broader context of systemic disparity. The defense attempted to undermine the numbers, but Vargas remained steady. Her response was firm and supported by documentation. She concluded her testimony with a sentence that resonated across the room. This arrest was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern long visible, yet repeatedly ignored. By the time the final arguments were delivered, the outcome felt inevitable. The prosecutor reminded the jury that authority without accountability becomes abuse. He reminded them that Lena had been a nurse heading home after saving lives, not a threat. He reminded them that the law protects civilians from officers who forget their duty. The defense, in contrast, offered a final plea for reasonable doubt, but the jury's faces remained still, unmoved. When the jury was dismissed for deliberation, hours passed with slow gravity. Lena sat between Elias and her attorney, hands clasped, eyes lowered. Elias placed his hand over hers, grounding her with a steady warmth. Reporters whispered. Spectators watched the door. Then, after several hours, the jury returned. Their foreperson stood, holding the form. The courtroom waited. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air, sharp and final. Lena closed her eyes. Elias exhaled, a tremor running through him. Cole stared forward, expression blank, as though the verdict had struck him numb. His attorney lowered his head. Judge Vivian Hale delivered the sentence days later, a term in federal prison. Her tone was firm, not vindictive. She spoke of the seriousness of the offense, the abuse of authority, the trauma inflicted on a family, and the importance of restoring public trust. She ended with a line that would be quoted across the country. "No badge grants the right to break the public you are sworn to protect." The gavel fell. The trial was done. And for the first time since that night on the street, Lena felt the beginning of something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Justice moving in the right direction. When the verdict settled and the sentencing was complete, Harlan Cole's life unraveled with a slow, unrelenting clarity, the kind that leaves a man staring at the pieces of his past with no way to put them back together. The Dallas Police Department moved first. Within days of the sentencing, he was formally terminated. His personnel file closed with a statement that cited gross misconduct, violation of constitutional rights, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. His pension, which he had once spoken of with pride, believing it was untouchable, was revoked under a rarely used clause reserved for those convicted of federal civil rights violations. He received the letter in jail, printed on plain white paper, the city seal stamped in the corner. He read it twice, slowly, the words pressing into him with a weight he had never felt while wearing the badge. He had spent years telling himself he was one of the good ones, a man doing a hard job in a hard place. Now those years were summarized in a single sentence that reduced his career to a cautionary tale. He folded the letter neatly, set it on the thin mattress, and stared at the wall, realizing for the first time that consequences had finally found him. His wife visited once. She sat behind the glass divider, her hands resting in her lap, her expression tired and distant. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply told him she had filed for divorce. She told him their children would be taking her maiden name. She told him they were leaving Dallas to avoid the scrutiny, the whispers, and the shame that surrounded his case. Cole tried to argue, tried to explain that he had not meant for things to go this far, but she stopped him with a quiet firmness he had never heard from her before. "You did this," she said. "You chose this path, and we will not follow you down it." Then she hung up the phone, stood, and walked away without looking back. He sat there long after the guard told him the visit was over, staring at the empty seat she had left behind. The marriage that had once been held together by routine and familiarity dissolved in a single conversation, leaving him alone with the truth he had spent years avoiding. When Cole completed his transfer to federal custody, he found himself in a medium-security prison, far from Dallas, far from the streets he once patrolled, with misplaced confidence. The environment was stripped of the authority he had once carried. Here, he was not an officer. He was an inmate. He learned quickly to keep to himself. Other prisoners recognized him from the news, and the knowledge that he had once worn a badge made him the target of long stares and low voices. He walked the yard with his head lowered, choosing silence over confrontation. The rhythms of prison life offered no comfort. Days blurred together. Nights stretched long, and each morning he woke to the same thought. His future had collapsed, and nothing waited for him outside the prison walls except a life he no longer recognized. While he served his sentence, the city of Dallas faced its own reckoning. The Department of Justice released a formal findings report that detailed years of racial disparity within traffic stops, disciplinary lapses, and patterns of ignoring internal complaints. The facts were clear, the data overwhelming, and the narrative undeniable. Under pressure from the DOJ, federal courts, and a community unwilling to let the moment pass, the city entered into a sweeping consent decree. It required new body camera technology with safeguards against disabling or tampering. It required mandatory bias training that could no longer be satisfied with a brief slideshow in a conference room. It mandated external review of all use-of-force incidents and established new protocols for supervisors to intervene early when officers developed patterns of questionable stops. Most significant of all, pretextual traffic stops, which had disproportionately affected black drivers for years, dropped substantially within a short time. These changes did not erase what happened to Lena, or to the countless others whose stories remain tucked away in forgotten files. But they marked the beginning of a shift that people had waited generations to see. When Cole was released after completing the first portion of his sentence, he stepped into a world that barely acknowledged him. He had no job, no savings, no pension, no family. He moved to a small town where no one knew his face at first, and he found temporary work as a night security guard at a large retail store. The irony was not lost on him. After years of believing he stood above the people he stopped on the streets, he now stood under fluorescent lights, scanning empty aisles, wearing a badge that held no authority and earned no respect. His supervisor was young, polite but brisk, reminding him that breaks were timed and schedules were fixed. His co-workers barely spoke to him. When someone eventually recognized him months later, an older man who had followed the trial, word spread quietly. People in the town avoided eye contact. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked by. The shame settled into him like a second skin, one he could not shed at night in his small rented apartment. He sometimes watched the news. He saw brief clips about Dallas's reforms, narrated by reporters who spoke of progress and accountability. He saw interviews with community leaders who described the changes as overdue. He never saw Lena, and he never saw Elias, but he knew their names were etched into the city's memory. He wondered if they ever thought about him, though deep down he understood they had no reason to. Their lives had moved on. His had stalled, and the responsibility for that divide rested squarely on his shoulders. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to reflect honestly, he recognized the truth he had long refused to face. He had wielded authority without restraint. He had relied on a system that shielded him from consequences, and he had believed, foolishly and arrogantly, that nothing would ever change. But it did. The law found him. The truth exposed him, and the city he once patrolled rebuilt itself without him. His fall was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the quiet, crushing collapse of a life built on the illusion of untouchable power. And in the end, the only legacy he carried was the one etched into the courtroom transcripts and the federal record, a legacy not of service, but of harm. In the years that followed, not quickly and not gently, but with the steady rhythm of a family learning how to live after a night that had nearly broken them, Lena Harper still worked nights at the hospital, moving through trauma bays with the same calm, steady hands she had always carried. Yet something within her work had changed. She was no longer just a nurse responding to emergencies. She had become the quiet anchor for patients who walked into the hospital, bruised, frightened, and unsure whether anyone would believe what had happened to them. Her supervisors noticed the way people gravitated toward her, the way she offered reassurance that came not from training alone, but from lived experience. So they asked her to lead a new hospital initiative, an advocacy program for victims of domestic violence and police violence, a program funded through a partnership with federal grants and community groups awakened by the reforms in Dallas. Lena accepted, not because the job was easy, but because she understood exactly what those victims needed. She knew the silence they carried, the fear that sat behind every breath, and the exhaustion of recounting a story that already hurt to remember. In the small office she kept at the end of the hall, she learned how to guide people through their trauma, offering what had once been missing for her. Someone who listened, someone who stayed, and someone who did not look away. At home, life had regained a rhythm, though not the same one that existed before. Lena and Elias moved their family to a quieter city, choosing a neighborhood with a school that offered Kai a fresh start. Now older, he had grown taller, steadier, and more expressive, though traces of that night still lived in him. Loud commands made him flinch, flashing lights made him tense, but therapy had helped him rediscover parts of himself he had buried. He began drawing again, not only the dark, heavy images that had once filled pages, but bright colors and layered shapes that told a story of a world he could trust again. His art teacher entered one of his paintings in a statewide youth exhibition. It depicted a street submerged in deep blue shadows, a mother standing peacefully in the center, and soft yellow light breaking through the darkness above her. He titled it Blue Lights and Mommy's Smile. The judges awarded him first place, and when he stood on the small stage to accept the prize, holding his certificate with shaking hands, Lena felt tears rise in her throat. Elias placed a steady hand on her back, sharing her quiet pride. Elias himself had stepped into a role he once thought he would never pursue. After the federal trial, after the public scrutiny, after the months of data, testimony, and reform debates, he was promoted to Director of the U.S. Marshal's Service. The news arrived in a simple envelope delivered by courier bearing the presidential seal. He read the letter twice before telling Lena. She listened calmly, then placed her hand over his and said with gentle certainty, "You earned this, not because of what happened to us, but because of who you've always been." As director, Elias created something the agency had never seen. A racial equity oversight unit tasked with reviewing disparities, collecting data, and ensuring complaints were investigated with the seriousness they deserved. He assembled a team of analysts, investigators, and community liaisons, insisting that accountability did not weaken federal law enforcement, but strengthened its legitimacy. His work was not celebrated by everyone, but he remained steady, knowing firsthand the cost of systems left unchecked. He never used his family's story publicly. He never needed to. The reforms spoke for themselves. In Dallas, the consent decree continued reshaping the city. Complaints were reviewed faster. Cameras captured what once went unseen. Training programs expanded, and the rate of pretextual stops kept falling. These changes did not erase the pain that had fueled them, but they offered a sense of progress. piece by piece. Still, every improvement reminded Lena that healing was not a destination. It was a practice, a responsibility, a refusal to let silence take root again. And so on the anniversary of the night when the blue and red lights first flashed behind her, the family returned to the street. They did it each year. They drove in quiet, arriving at the exact moment everything had fractured. The street was calmer now, less patrolled. The reforms reshaping the way officers engaged with drivers at night. But Lena did not come to observe the changes. She came to mark the memory. She stepped out of the car with a small bag in her hand. Inside were 3 candles, each meant for someone who had carried part of the weight. One for her, one for Elias, and one for Kai. She placed them carefully on the patch of pavement where her car once sat, where fear had once taken hold of her breath. Elias stood beside her, solemn, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Kai held the lighter, his movement steady and deliberate as the candles flickered to life. Their warm glow softened the space around them. They stood silently, letting the early morning stillness wash over them. Lena felt the old memory stir, the force of the hand on her arm, the metal frame against her head, her son's scream. But she also felt something else, something stronger. The resilience that had carried her forward, the justice that had followed, and the family that had refused to be broken. Elias whispered, "You're still here. We're all still here." She nodded, breathing deeply, letting the truth of those words settle inside her. Kai looked up at her, his face illuminated by the soft candlelight. "Mommy," he said quietly, "the lights don't scare me as much anymore." She bent down, touched his cheek gently, and whispered, "That's because you're stronger now, and because we're together." They remained for several minutes, standing in a circle of quiet light, honoring not just what had happened, but what had risen from it. When the candles burned low, Lena reached down and traced her fingertips lightly across the pavement. The concrete felt cool beneath her hand, unchanging, but her heart no longer tightened at the touch. She rose slowly, took Elias's hand, and walked back to the car with the grace of someone who had reclaimed her power, one breath at a time. As they drove away, the street faded behind them. But the meaning of the ritual lingered. The lights, once a symbol of fear, now stood for something different. They stood for vigilance, truth, and a promise carried quietly between them. The lights stay on as long as someone is willing to speak, willing to fight, and willing to remember. And as long as their family returned to that spot each year, the city would not forget what had happened there, or the strength it took to rise from it. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please subscribe and leave a like. Your support helps these voices be heard.